Consider the weight of debt, not the abstract anxiety we feel when bills arrive, but the physical sensation of owing more than you can ever repay. In 1763, in a cramped workshop on Glasgow's Saltmarket, a 37-year-old instrument maker named James Watt felt that weight with particular intensity. Outside his door, creditors demanded £140. Inside, his daily wage amounted to 7 shillings. The mathematics of his predicament were brutally simple. At his current rate, he would need 400 working days to clear his debts, assuming he spent nothing on food, rent, or the medicines his wife Margaret desperately needed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Watt's workshop sat in the grounds of Glasgow University, a privilege that offered protection from immediate arrest but not from the growing anxiety that accompanied each knock at the door. The room smelled of brass filings and machine oil, its shelves crowded with astrolabes, theodolites, and the delicate instruments natural philosophers used to measure their world. He was skilled at his craft. When a barometer arrived broken from London, Watt could repair it. When a professor needed a custom-built quadrant for astronomical observations, Watt delivered precision. But precision, as he was learning, did not guarantee prosperity. His hands, steady enough to calibrate instruments to fractions of an inch, trembled slightly when he counted coins. 7 shillings a day amounted to £2 and 2 shillings weekly. From this, he paid £1 for lodgings, 10 shillings for food, and whatever remained went toward Margaret's increasing medical expenses. She had begun coughing blood 6 months earlier. The physician's fees alone consumed 5 shillings per visit, and he recommended visits twice weekly. The medicine cost another 3 shillings. The arithmetic left nothing for creditors, and creditors had limited patience. The bailiffs had already visited twice. Scottish law permitted them to seize tools as payment for debt, and tools were everything Watt owned of value. His lathe, his files, his measuring instruments represented not just his livelihood but his identity. Without them, he was nothing. With them, he remained perpetually on the edge of nothing, earning just enough to forestall disaster, but never enough to escape it. Into this precarious existence arrived a curiosity that would alter everything. In January of 1763, John Anderson, professor of natural philosophy, carried a small brass device into Watt's workshop. It was a model Newcomen engine, a miniature version of the massive steam-powered pumps that kept Britain's mines dry. The university owned it for demonstration purposes, to show students the principles of atmospheric pressure and heat. It had stopped working, and Anderson wanted Watt to repair it. Watt had seen Newcomen engines operating at collieries around Glasgow. They were monstrous affairs, their great rocking beams visible from miles away, their appetites for coal legendary. Miners complained about them constantly. The engines consumed as much coal as they helped extract. Vast quantities burned to boil water, create steam, and drive pistons that pumped water from ever deeper shafts. But they worked, after a fashion, and no one had invented anything better in 50 years of trying. The model that Anderson brought was perhaps 2 feet tall, its cylinder no wider than a man's wrist, its mechanisms reduced to toy scale. Yet it should have worked on the same principles as its giant cousins. Steam entered the cylinder, pushing a piston upward. Cold water sprayed into the cylinder, condensing the steam and creating a vacuum. Atmospheric pressure then drove the piston downward, with force sufficient to pump water. The cycle repeated, stroke after stroke, hour after hour. Except this model didn't cycle. It made steam readily enough when Watt fired the boiler, but the piston barely moved. He suspected the cylinder walls were leaking steam, or perhaps the valves were misaligned. He spent 2 days cleaning every component, checking every seal, adjusting every tolerance. When he reassembled it and applied heat, the engine sputtered to life, managed 3 weak strokes, then stopped again. Watt stared at the device with growing frustration. His training was in precision instruments, not steam engines. Yet something about the model's failure intrigued him. It wasn't simply broken. It was consuming enormous amounts of steam for the tiny amount of work it performed. He began making calculations. He measured the cylinder's volume, calculated how much steam it required per stroke, and compared this to the pitiful mechanical work it produced. The numbers appalled him. The engine used 24 pounds of coal to perform 1 hour's work, equal to the lifting power of a horse. A real horse, fed on hay, cost far less to operate and didn't require a boiler, pipes, or constant attention from skilled engineers. But horses couldn't work 200 feet underground in flooded mine shafts. Horses drowned. Steam engines, however inefficient, represented the only technology capable of pumping water from depths where mineral wealth lay waiting. Mines across Britain depended on Newcomen engines, accepting their enormous fuel costs, because the alternative was abandoning valuable seams to flooding. Watt began spending his evenings calculating instead of repairing instruments. If the model consumed 24 pounds of coal per horsepower hour, and full-size Newcomen engines at collieries showed similar inefficiency, then Britain's mines were burning vast fortunes simply keeping water at bay. He estimated, conservatively, that coal worth £2 million sterling annually vanished into Newcomen engines, producing less than 1% useful work while the rest dissipated as waste heat. The inefficiency had a clear cause. Each stroke required heating the cylinder with steam, then immediately cooling it with water spray to create the vacuum. The metal cylinder spent half its time being heated and half being cooled, a cycle that consumed enormous energy while producing minimal work. The cylinder's own thermal mass represented lost work. Every stroke wasted heat, raising the temperature of iron that would immediately be cooled again. Margaret noticed the change in him. He came to bed later, his hands still smudged with soot from experiments. She heard him muttering calculations in his sleep. When she coughed, the sound pulled him from deep concentration, and he would look at her with an expression mixing guilt and helplessness. The medicine wasn't working. Her condition worsened through the winter months, and Watt's income remained frozen at 7 shillings daily, while her needs multiplied. The creditors grew more aggressive. One appeared at the workshop in March, informing Watt that legal action would commence unless payment arrived within 30 days. Another sent notice that he would petition the courts for seizure of tools. Watt spent an afternoon calculating whether he could hide his most valuable instruments with friends before bailiffs arrived, then realized such action would only delay the inevitable while destroying his relationship with the university that protected him. Yet he couldn't stop thinking about the engine. He obtained permission to borrow the model for further study, promising Anderson he would return it in better working order. Instead, he began systematic experiments that consumed his nights and several shillings weekly in coal for the boiler. He modified the valves, trying different timing sequences. He insulated the cylinder with layers of wood and felt, hoping to reduce the heat loss. Nothing produced significant improvement. The fundamental problem remained. The cylinder had to be both very hot and very cold in rapid succession, and this requirement guaranteed massive waste. He spent 7 shillings of borrowed money commissioning a brass cylinder with thicker walls, reasoning that greater thermal mass might retain heat better. The new cylinder performed worse than the original, taking even longer to cool between strokes. The experiment cost him a week's wages and proved exactly the opposite of his hypothesis. Margaret asked him why he persisted with a toy that brought no income. He had no good answer. The university paid him to repair instruments, not redesign steam engines. Every hour spent on the Newcomen model was an hour he wasn't earning. Yet something deeper than financial calculation drove him forward. He sensed that understanding this machine's inefficiency might lead somewhere significant, even if he couldn't yet articulate where. Spring arrived in 1763 with no improvement in the model's performance and significant deterioration in Watt's financial position. He now owed £150 to various creditors, a sum that would take more than a year of careful saving to repay if he spent nothing on living expenses. One creditor obtained a warrant permitting seizure of property should payment not arrive within 60 days. Watt consulted with university officials about whether his position offered legal protection from such actions. The answer provided minimal comfort. The university could not prevent lawful seizure, only delay it through procedural challenges. In May, Margaret's physician recommended she move to warmer, drier lodgings. The damp ground floor rooms they rented contributed to her worsening condition, he explained. Lodgings on an upper floor facing south, with better air circulation, might slow the disease's progress. Such lodgings cost an additional 10 shillings weekly. Watt lacked 10 shillings weekly. He lacked 10 shillings monthly. He calculated that accepting the physician's recommendation would push him into bankruptcy within 6 weeks. He moved Margaret to better rooms anyway, borrowing £20 from a colleague against future earnings. This loan added to his existing debts while improving nothing except his wife's immediate comfort. She knew what the move cost him. She tried to insist they remain where they were, that her health wasn't worth destroying his livelihood. He refused to discuss it. Some decisions transcended calculation, even for a man who thought in numbers. The borrowed Newcomen model sat on his workbench, mocking him with its stubborn inefficiency. He had now spent 4 months studying it, had performed dozens of experiments, had filled notebooks with calculations and observations, and had achieved precisely nothing except a deeper understanding of why the machine failed. Understanding failure, he was discovering, differed substantially from achieving success. In June, he received notice that his largest creditor would seek court orders for seizure within 30 days. 30 days represented approximately 180 shillings in earnings. He owed the creditor alone more than 200 times that amount. The mathematics permitted no escape. He would lose his tools, lose his position at the university, and lose any hope of supporting Margaret through her illness. He should have returned the model to Anderson and focused entirely on paid work. Instead, he found himself conducting more experiments, trying different combinations of cylinder temperature and water injection timing, measuring steam consumption with increasingly elaborate instrumentation. He realized, avoiding the inevitable by obsessing over an insoluble problem. The engine consumed vast amounts of steam because condensing steam inside the cylinder required cooling the cylinder, and reheating the cooled cylinder required enormous energy. This was fundamental thermodynamics. No clever adjustment of valves or insulation could overcome it, unless the condensing happened somewhere other than the cylinder. The thought arrived one evening in late June as he cleaned the model after another failed experiment. What if the steam never entered the cylinder to be condensed? What if it flowed to a separate chamber, leaving the cylinder perpetually hot while condensation occurred elsewhere? The cylinder could remain at maximum temperature, never wasting energy in repeated heating and cooling cycles, while a separate condenser maintained constant coldness. He sat motionless for several minutes, testing the idea for obvious flaws. Steam would need to flow from the hot cylinder to the cold condenser, which meant a pipe and a valve. The separate condenser would need constant cooling, requiring water circulation. The vacuum created by condensation would need to draw the piston as effectively as condensation within the cylinder had. Each component added complexity and potential failure points. But if it worked, the efficiency gains would be revolutionary. The cylinder would never cool, eliminating the enormous energy waste of repeated heating cycles. The condenser would never need heating, eliminating wasted energy there as well. The engine would consume a fraction of the steam current designs required, perhaps 1/4, perhaps less. He began sketching immediately, drawing cylinders and condensers, valves and pipes, working through mechanical details on paper before attempting construction. The drawings filled page after page through the night. When dawn arrived, he had preliminary designs for a steam engine fundamentally different from any machine previously built. He also had no money to build even a crude prototype, 3 weeks before creditors could seize his tools, and a wife whose coughing had grown worse through the night. The mathematics of possibility confronted the mathematics of poverty, and poverty appeared stronger, yet the idea persisted, demanding attention even as practical concerns screamed for focus. James Watt had discovered something remarkable sitting in his debt-haunted workshop. Whether he could transform discovery into reality before circumstances destroyed him entirely remained uncertain. But the separate condenser, conceived in desperation, promised to change everything if he survived long enough to build it. The distance between conception and creation can measure years, even when the idea is brilliant. James Watt understood his separate condenser would revolutionize steam power. He could see it working in his mind with perfect clarity. The cylinder remaining hot, the condenser remaining cold, steam flowing between them through carefully controlled valves, efficiency multiplying fourfold or perhaps more. The vision was complete. The execution remained impossible. Building even a simple prototype required resources he didn't possess. The cylinder needed to be bored with precision, unprecedented in steam engine construction. Leaks that were acceptable in inefficient Newcomen engines would be catastrophic in his design. The tolerances required approached those of scientific instruments, not industrial machinery. He needed brass fittings, iron castings, copper pipes, valves, gaskets, and access to a workshop equipped for metalwork far beyond simple instrument repair. He needed, conservatively, £50 just to begin. He possessed 7 shillings. Through July of 1763, Watt approached everyone he knew with capital. He explained his discovery to Glasgow merchants, to university professors with family money, to anyone who might understand that steam engine efficiency represented fortunes waiting to be made. His pitch was technically sound but commercially unpromising. He was an instrument maker, not an engineer. He had never built a working engine, only repaired a broken model. His design existed only on paper, unproven by experiment, and he needed investment immediately, before creditors seized his tools and ended his career. No one invested. Several listened politely before declining. Most declined without listening. The fundamental problem was credibility. Newcomen engines had worked essentially unchanged for 50 years. Mining companies accepted their enormous fuel costs because the engines reliably pumped water. Watt was proposing to redesign everything based on calculations and untested theory. Why should anyone risk capital on such speculation, particularly from a man who couldn't pay his own debts? The creditor deadline arrived in early August. Watt received formal notice that bailiffs would seize property within 7 days unless he provided £40 immediately toward his largest outstanding debt. £40. He possessed less than 3. He spent the next 72 hours in various forms of desperate negotiation, offering to pay 5 shillings weekly if granted forbearance, promising repayment within 2 years, pleading for mercy based on his wife's illness. The creditor granted him 30 additional days, not from mercy, but from calculation. Selling seized tools at auction would recover perhaps 30% of their value. If Watt continued working and paying small amounts, the creditor might eventually recover more. The extension came with harsh terms: 10 shillings weekly minimum payment, default on any single payment triggering immediate seizure, and interest added to the principal. 10 shillings weekly from an income of 35 shillings meant that after paying room, food, and Margaret's medical expenses, Watt would have nothing remaining. He accepted anyway, because the alternative was immediate catastrophe. He would somehow find additional income or reduce expenses or achieve some miracle that mathematics insisted was impossible. Margaret grew weaker through August. The coughing produced more blood. She could barely walk from bed to chair without exhaustion. The physician recommended beef broth daily, red, wine for strength and complete rest. Beef broth and wine cost money Watt didn't have. Complete rest required someone to tend her constantly, which meant hiring help that cost more money he didn't have. She tried to minimize her needs, insisting she felt better than she did, refusing treatments she knew they couldn't afford. Her consideration made everything worse. Watt would have preferred demands he couldn't meet over stoic suffering that broke his heart. He should have abandoned the steam engine idea entirely. Every rational calculation indicated he needed to maximize income and minimize distraction. Yet through August and into September, between paid repair work, after Margaret fell asleep, sometimes through entire nights, he continued refining his designs. He filled notebooks with calculations, exploring how much efficiency gain a separate condenser might achieve. His estimates grew more optimistic as he worked through the thermodynamics. Perhaps not merely fourfold improvement, but fivefold, perhaps even greater. He calculated what such efficiency would mean for Britain's mining industry. A Newcomen engine consuming 24 pounds of coal per horsepower hour cost mine owners enormous sums annually. A Watt engine consuming 5 pounds per horsepower hour would save fortunes. If he charged mine owners 1/3 of the coal savings compared to Newcomen engines, everyone profited. Mines saved money, he earned income, and coal consumption dropped dramatically. The business model was elegant, the technology remained unbuilt, and his personal financial situation deteriorated weekly despite the payment extension. Margaret's medical expenses increased as her condition worsened. The physician now visited 3 times weekly at 5 shillings per visit. The medicine had changed to more expensive compounds. Even buying coal to heat their rooms consumed precious shillings as autumn cold arrived. In October, Watt learned that John Roebuck, owner of the Carron Iron Works near Edinburgh, had developed interest in steam engines. Roebuck was wealthy, technically sophisticated, and actively seeking new technologies to improve his operations. Someone suggested Watt contact him about the separate condenser concept. Watt wrote immediately, explaining his discovery and requesting a meeting to discuss potential investment. Roebuck's reply arrived 3 weeks later. He would meet Watt in Glasgow in December, but made no promises about investment. The letter offered hope, distant and conditional, but hope nonetheless. Watt spent the intervening weeks preparing drawings and calculations to present. He needed to convince Roebuck that separate condensation wasn't merely theoretical, that it would work in practice, that investing in development would yield substantial returns. December brought snow and Margaret's collapse. She fainted while standing, fell, and couldn't rise. The physician examined her and delivered his assessment quietly, away from her hearing. The tuberculosis had advanced significantly. She might survive the winter with careful nursing and expensive treatments. Without them, she would certainly die within months, possibly weeks. The treatments cost £3 weekly. Watt earned approximately £2 weekly after basic expenses. The mathematics permitted no discussion. He borrowed another £30 from colleagues, knowing he was destroying any remaining credit he possessed. The borrowed money purchased 2 months of treatments, maybe 3 if they economized severely elsewhere. John Roebuck arrived in Glasgow 2 days before Christmas, 1763. He was 45 years old, confident, accustomed to making rapid decisions about complex technical matters. Watt spread his drawings across the university workshop bench and explained separate condensation while Roebuck examined the papers and asked pointed questions. How would the cylinder maintain temperature without losing heat to surroundings? How would condensation in a separate chamber create sufficient vacuum? How would valves control steam flow between components? Had Watt calculated the pipe diameters required? Watt had answers for most questions. Others required honest admission that only experimental testing would determine optimal configurations. Roebuck appreciated the honesty. He had encountered too many inventors who promised certainty about untested ideas. Watt's combination of rigorous calculation and acknowledgement of unknowns suggested genuine understanding rather than wishful speculation. After 2 hours of technical discussion, Roebuck made his offer. He would fund construction of a full-scale experimental engine. Watt would design it. Roebuck's Iron Works would manufacture the components, and they would test it at Carron. If it worked, they would form a partnership to commercialize the invention. Roebuck would cover all development costs. In exchange, he wanted 2/3 ownership of any patents and future profits. Watt wanted to negotiate better terms. His invention, his discovery, merited more than 1/3 ownership, but negotiations required leverage, and Watt possessed none. He was 1 week from missing his payment to creditors, 3 months from complete destitution, and utterly dependent on his wife surviving until circumstances improved. He accepted Roebuck's offer without modification. They signed preliminary agreements in January of 1764. Roebuck immediately paid Watt £50 for living expenses and to satisfy the most threatening creditors. It felt like enormous wealth after months of desperation. It would last perhaps 6 months if Watt spent carefully. He paid the most aggressive creditor £40, bought better medicine for Margaret, and tried to focus on designing his experimental engine without constantly calculating how many weeks remained before poverty returned. The design work consumed the first half of 1764. Watt needed to specify exact dimensions for every component, cylinder diameter and stroke length, pipe sizes connecting cylinder to condenser, condenser volume and cooling water requirements, valve sizes and timing mechanisms, piston construction, and sealing methods. Each decision involved complex thermodynamic calculations and trade-offs between theoretical efficiency and practical manufacturability. The cylinder presented the greatest challenge. Newcomen engines used cylinders bored from cast iron, their tolerances measured in fractions of inches. Steam leaking past the piston represented accepted inefficiency. Watt's design demanded far greater precision. If steam leaked significantly, the separate condenser advantage vanished. He needed cylinder boring accurate to 1/32 of an inch, precision that existing techniques couldn't reliably achieve. He began developing improved boring methods, designing cutting tools that would machine cylinder interiors to unprecedented smoothness. This work carried him into territories far beyond instrument repair. He was inventing manufacturing processes while simultaneously inventing the product requiring those processes. Each problem solved revealed 3 more requiring attention. By summer of 1764, Watt had completed detailed specifications and Carron Iron Works began manufacturing components. The cylinder alone required 4 months to cast and bore. The condenser presented unexpected challenges in achieving sufficient cooling. The valves needed complete redesign twice when initial concepts proved mechanically infeasible. What Watt imagined as 6 months of development stretched toward a year. Margaret rallied slightly during the spring, well enough to walk in the garden on warm afternoons. Watt allowed himself cautious hope that the expensive treatments were working, that she might recover sufficiently to enjoy the success he was building. She encouraged his work on the engine, asking about his progress, understanding that their future depended on transforming his discovery into functioning reality. In August, Roebuck's Iron Works completed the major components and began assembling the experimental engine at Carron. Watt travelled there weekly to oversee installation and testing. The first attempts to operate the engine revealed immediate problems. The cylinder, despite careful boring, leaked steam past the piston. The condenser couldn't maintain sufficient vacuum. The valves stuck at high temperatures. The entire machine vibrated dangerously when operating at full power. Watt spent September and October making modifications. He redesigned the piston sealing, using multiple rings and packing materials to prevent leaks. He increased condenser size and improved cooling water circulation. He replaced brass valves with iron ones that tolerated heat better. Each change required manufacturing new components, testing them, and often redesigning again when results disappointed. By November of 1764, the engine ran for consecutive minutes without stopping, a significant achievement, even if performance remained far below predictions. The separate condenser was working. The cylinder stayed hot while condensation occurred elsewhere, but efficiency gains measured perhaps 50% over Newcomen engines, not the fourfold or fivefold improvement Watt had calculated. Something was still fundamentally wrong. Steam leaked somewhere, or heat dissipated through uninsulated surfaces, or the condenser wasn't achieving complete vacuum. Watt conducted systematic tests, measuring temperatures and pressures at different points, trying to identify where predicted performance diverged from actual results. The testing consumed months while his borrowed money dwindled. Margaret's condition worsened again as winter cold settled over Glasgow. The brief summer improvement vanished. She coughed blood more frequently, could barely eat, spent entire days in bed too exhausted to rise. The physician was honest. She was dying. The treatments had merely slowed the inevitable. She might survive to spring if Watt continued paying for expensive care. Without it, she would be gone within weeks. Watt was nearly bankrupt again. Roebuck had covered development costs but not Watt's living expenses beyond the initial £50. That money had vanished into creditors' accounts and medical bills months earlier. He earned nothing while working full-time on the experimental engine. His debts had merely paused, not disappeared. Creditors who had accepted token payments during his university employment now demanded larger sums or threatened renewed legal action. In January of 1765, the experimental engine achieved 3 consecutive hours of operation. Performance remained below predictions, but clearly superior to Newcomen engines. Watt calculated fuel savings of approximately 60%, substantial but not revolutionary. The machine needed more work, perhaps another year of refinement, before offering compelling commercial advantages. He lacked a year, he lacked 6 months. Margaret was dying, creditors were threatening, and Roebuck was growing impatient with development costs exceeding projections. The partnership that had seemed like salvation now felt like just another form of pressure, gentler than bailiffs but inexorable nonetheless. Through February and March, Watt pushed the experimental engine harder, conducting longer tests, measuring performance under varying conditions, searching for the hidden flaw, preventing optimal efficiency. He spent entire weeks at Carron, sleeping in workshop corners, eating irregularly, obsessed with understanding where his calculations diverged from reality. Margaret died on April 4, 1765, while Watt was at Carron, adjusting valves. He received word the next morning. She had been alone when the end came, attended only by a hired nurse, because he was 30 miles away, trying to make a machine work. The guilt joined his growing collection of unpayable debts. The funeral cost £12. Watt borrowed it from Roebuck, adding to accounts he couldn't settle. He spent a week in Glasgow settling Margaret's affairs, paying final medical bills, closing their lodgings. Then he returned to Carron and worked with intensity that bordered on madness. If he could make the engine work perfectly, if he could achieve the efficiency his calculations promised, then somehow the suffering would have meaning. Margaret's death, his poverty, the years of desperate struggle would transform into the price paid for progress that benefited humanity. The engine remained stubbornly imperfect. By June of 1765, Watt had achieved 70% efficiency improvement over Newcomen engines. Significant, but not transformative. Not worth the investment Roebuck had made. Not worth the years Watt had sacrificed. The separate condenser worked exactly as theory predicted. Something else was limiting performance. Something he couldn't identify despite systematic testing. In desperation, he conducted over 300 individual experiments between June and December, varying every parameter he could control: cylinder temperature, condenser cooling rate, valve timing, steam pressure, piston speed. He documented everything in notebooks filled with measurements and observations. The work was methodical, exhaustive, and ultimately frustrating. Performance improved incrementally, but never achieved the breakthrough efficiency that would justify commercialization. Roebuck suggested abandoning the project. They had proven separate condensation worked, but not well enough to displace existing technology. Perhaps they should patent the concept defensively and move on to other ventures. Watt refused. His calculations showed the design should work brilliantly. The fault lay not in theory, but in execution, in manufacturing tolerances they couldn't quite to achieve, in heat losses they couldn't quite prevent, in subtle mechanical inefficiencies accumulating into substantial overall performance degradation. He needed better precision. He needed cylinder boring accurate to 1/64th of an inch instead of 1/32nd. He needed seamless pipes that didn't leak minute amounts of steam. He needed piston sealing that approached perfection. None of these things existed in 1765. The industrial capacity to manufacture components meeting his requirements simply hadn't been developed yet. Watt began designing the manufacturing equipment necessary to build better engines. This was insane on multiple levels. He was already struggling to perfect an engine based on radical innovation. Now he proposed inventing the tools required to manufacture that engine properly. The work expanded exponentially while his resources contracted toward nothing. By December of 1765, Watt owed Roebuck over £600 in advanced funds and accumulated expenses. The experimental engine worked but didn't excel. They had no customers, no income, and no clear path forward. Roebuck wanted to close the project. Watt insisted on continuing. They compromised. Development would pause while Watt sought additional expertise and funding. The engine would remain at Carron, incomplete but operational enough to demonstrate separate condensation to potential investors. Watt returned to Glasgow, nearly broken. 2 years of intensive work had produced an engine that worked poorly and an instruction manual for manufacturing processes that didn't exist. He had sacrificed his marriage, his health, and his financial security pursuing a vision that remained frustratingly out of reach. He was 39 years old, widowed, bankrupt, and unable to build the machine he had invented. The separate condenser existed now beyond his imagination. It was real, proven, documented, and it was worthless without precision engineering. That no one in Britain could deliver. James Watt had discovered how to revolutionize steam power. He simply couldn't build it well enough to matter. That was where things stood as 1766 began, with Watt within 3 days of debtor's prison and his revolutionary engine sitting incomplete at Carron. Neither success nor failure, but something more frustrating than either. In 1767, Matthew Boulton stood at the centre of what contemporaries called the eighth wonder of the world. The Soho manufactory, located 2 miles from Birmingham, employed 600 workers across workshops, producing everything from buttons and buckles to scientific instruments and decorative metalwork. The facility generated £8,000 in annual profit, an enormous sum that reflected both Boulton's business acumen and Britain's growing appetite for precision manufactured goods. Boulton was 42 years old, successful beyond the dreams of most manufacturers, and profoundly bored with buckles. He had inherited a profitable business from his father and expanded it brilliantly, but producing ornamental hardware for wealthy customers no longer challenged him. He wanted to build something consequential. He wanted his manufactory's precision metalworking capabilities applied to machines that mattered. He wanted, though he couldn't have articulated it clearly in 1767, exactly what James Watt had invented. They met through mutual acquaintances who understood that Boulton was seeking new ventures, and Watt was seeking someone capable of manufacturing precision components. The introduction happened in Birmingham at the Lunar Society, where natural philosophers and industrialists gathered monthly to discuss science and technology. Watt attended reluctantly, uncomfortable in social settings, aware that his shabby coat and evident poverty marked him as charity among successful men. Boulton listened to Watt's explanation of separate condensation, with the attention of someone evaluating commercial potential rather than merely satisfying curiosity. He asked about efficiency improvements, manufacturing requirements, market size, potential returns on investment. The questions were shrewd but not hostile. Boulton clearly understood both technical innovation and business reality. When Watt admitted the experimental engine at Carron worked but performed below predictions, Boulton asked why. Watt explained the precision problem. His design required manufacturing tolerances that existing boring techniques couldn't consistently achieve. Cylinders leaked steam past pistons, no matter how carefully sealed. Pipes developed microscopic cracks under thermal stress. Valves wore unevenly and lost efficiency over time. The separate condenser concept was sound. The execution remained impossible without better manufacturing methods. Boulton asked what better methods would require. Watt described the improved boring machines he had designed but couldn't build, the precision measuring tools necessary to verify component accuracy, the quality control procedures that would catch flaws before assembly. Each requirement added cost and complexity to manufacturing. Boulton nodded, calculating, and then said something that changed everything. Soho Manufactory could build what Watt needed. The workshops employed skilled machinists accustomed to precision work. The facility had lathes, drills, boring equipment superior to what Roebuck's ironworks possessed. More importantly, Boulton understood that developing new manufacturing capabilities created competitive advantages beyond any single product. If Soho could bore cylinders accurately, that expertise would be valuable regardless of whether Watt's engine succeeded commercially. But Boulton wanted to see the experimental engine before committing resources. In March of 1767, he travelled to Carron with Watt and examined the machine that had consumed years of effort and produced mostly frustration. He watched it operate for 2 hours, noting the steam leaks, hearing the mechanical irregularities, observing the disappointing power output. Then he asked Watt to explain, component by component, why performance fell short of calculations. Watt walked Boulton through the thermodynamics, pointing out where heat leaked away, where steam pressure dropped below optimal levels, where friction consumed useful work. He was honest about the gaps between theoretical efficiency and actual performance. He didn't oversell or make promises he couldn't support with evidence. He simply explained what he knew, what he suspected, and what remained mysterious despite extensive testing. Boulton made calculations of his own while Watt talked. The existing engine, even with its flaws, exceeded Newcomb in efficiency by perhaps 60%. If Soho's precision manufacturing could push that to 75 or 80%, the commercial potential became substantial. Britain's mines consumed millions of pounds of coal annually in pumping operations. Even modest efficiency improvements represented vast savings for mine owners and substantial profits for anyone providing superior technology. He made his proposal directly. He would invest in perfecting Watt's engine and manufacturing it at Soho. He wanted equal partnership, not the 2/3 ownership Roebuck had demanded. Watt and Boulton would share all costs, risks, and eventual profits equally. However, Boulton insisted on one non-negotiable condition. Watt must move to Birmingham and work at Soho full-time during development. Watt hesitated. Moving to Birmingham meant leaving Glasgow, abandoning his university workshop, disconnecting from the few friends and colleagues he possessed. It meant complete dependence on Boulton's continued support with no fallback position if partnership failed. He had been nearly destroyed once by depending on Roebuck's investment. Repeating that vulnerability terrified him. But what was the alternative? Return to instrument repair while his revolutionary engine gathered dust at Carron? Abandon years of work because implementing it frightened him? Margaret was dead, his debts were crushing, and he was 39 years old with nothing to show for a decade of brilliant insights except proof that brilliance alone achieved nothing. He accepted Boulton's offer in April of 1767. The partnership agreement formalized in May specified that Boulton would cover all development costs, Watt would provide technical expertise and patent rights, and they would split future profits equally after recovering Boulton's investment. It was extraordinarily generous compared to typical manufacturing partnerships. Boulton could have demanded controlling interest given his capital advantage. Instead, he offered genuine collaboration between equals. Watt moved to Birmingham in June. Boulton provided lodging and a modest salary for living expenses. More importantly, he provided access to Soho's workshops and skilled craftsmen. Watt could finally work with machinists capable of executing his designs, with precision measuring equipment accurate enough to verify component quality, with materials and tools he had previously only imagined possessing. The first priority was building a new experimental engine, incorporating everything learned from the Carron failures. Watt spent the summer of 1767 designing improved cylinder boring equipment, better valve mechanisms, more efficient condensers. Boulton assigned his best machinists to the project and told them to prioritize quality over speed. Cost was secondary to achieving the performance Watt's calculations predicted. By autumn, Soho had completed a boring machine capable of machining cylinder interiors to 1/64-inch tolerance, twice the precision of previous equipment. The machine used multiple cutting heads operating simultaneously, with continuous measurement ensuring uniformity throughout the boring process. It was revolutionary manufacturing technology, developed specifically to build one experimental steam engine. The boring machine alone cost Boulton over £400. The new cylinder demonstrated immediately that precision mattered enormously. Steam leakage dropped to negligible levels. Piston motion became smooth and consistent. Thermal efficiency improved as the cylinder maintained steady temperature without losing heat through poorly fitted components. When they assembled the complete engine and fired it in January of 1768, performance exceeded the Carron engine by a substantial margin, but it still fell short of Watt's calculations. They achieved perhaps 90% of predicted efficiency, far better than any previous engine but frustratingly incomplete. Watt conducted more systematic testing, trying to identify the remaining losses. He discovered that pipe connections leaked minute amounts of steam, that certain valve designs created turbulence, reducing pressure, that heat radiated away through uninsulated surfaces faster than calculations suggested. Each discovery led to modifications: better gaskets for pipe joints, redesigned valves with smoother flow characteristics, extensive insulation wrapped around every hot surface. The modifications required manufacturing new components, testing them, often redesigning and testing again. Boulton covered every expense without complaint. He had committed to perfecting the engine, and perfection, they were discovering, was expensive. Through 1768 and into 1769, Watt refined the engine while simultaneously documenting manufacturing procedures. It wasn't enough to build one excellent engine. They needed repeatable processes that would produce consistent quality across multiple units. Every successful modification had to be translated into specifications that machinists could follow reliably. Every component needed inspection criteria, ensuring it met design requirements. Boulton was building more than an engine. He was developing industrial processes that would define precision manufacturing for decades. The skills his machinists developed, boring cylinders, the quality control procedures they implemented, the measuring tools they created, all of this represented capital investment beyond immediate engine development. Boulton understood that even if Watt's engines failed commercially, Soho's enhanced capabilities would be valuable. By mid-1769, the experimental engine was achieving remarkable performance. Fuel consumption measured roughly one-quarter that of comparable Newcomen engines. The fourfold efficiency improvement Watt had predicted 5 years earlier was finally real, proven by extensive testing. The engine ran reliably for days without mechanical problems. It generated smooth, consistent power, ideal for industrial applications. It was ready for commercialization. Except they had no patent, no legal protection preventing competitors from copying their design. Watt had filed preliminary patent applications years earlier, but never completed the formal process. Patents were expensive, requiring detailed specifications and legal fees he couldn't afford. Now, with a working engine and commercial prospects, patent protection became essential before manufacturing could begin. Watt filed comprehensive patent applications in January of 1769, documenting separate condensation and numerous related innovations. The legal process consumed months and cost over £100 in fees. Boulton paid without hesitation. Legal protection was fundamental to recovering his investment. Without patents, any competitor could copy their design once they began selling engines, eliminating profit margins through competition. The patent was granted in April of 1769, giving Watt exclusive rights to separate condenser steam engines for 14 years. 14 years from 1769 meant patent protection until 1783. Boulton calculated that 14 years was barely sufficient to recover development costs and generate returns justifying his investment. They would need to manufacture and sell engines aggressively to maximize the limited patent period, but they faced immediate problems. John Roebuck still owned 2/3 interest in Watt's original patents and partnership agreements. Roebuck's financial situation had deteriorated severely. His ironworks was nearly bankrupt, he owed massive debts, and his interest in Watt's engine represented one of his few remaining assets. He wouldn't surrender his ownership stake without compensation, and compensation required money Boulton and Watt didn't want to spend. Negotiations with Roebuck continued through the summer of 1769 and into 1770. Roebuck wanted £1,500 for his interest. Boulton countered with £500. They eventually settled at £1,000, plus assumption of Roebuck's outstanding loans to Watt, which totaled another £600. The transaction cost Boulton substantially but simplified ownership and cleared Watt's debts completely for the first time in a decade. With clear patent rights and no competing claims, Boulton and Watt could finally begin commercial operations. They established pricing based on coal savings compared to Newcomen engines. Customers would pay an annual premium equal to 1/3 the value of coal saved by using Watt engines instead of comparable Newcomen machines. This meant Watt engines cost nothing up front but generated recurring revenue based on verified efficiency improvements. The pricing model was brilliant marketing. Mine owners risked nothing trying new technology. They paid only when engines delivered measurable savings. Boulton and Watt's income depended entirely on providing genuine efficiency advantages. Everyone's incentives aligned perfectly. The challenge was calculating accurate coal savings, requiring careful measurement at each installation, but that challenge beat convincing skeptical customers to buy unproven technology. They needed their first customer, someone willing to test revolutionary engines in real mining operations. Boulton leveraged his extensive business connections, contacting mine owners throughout Britain, explaining the technology, offering favorable terms for early adopters. The responses ranged from cautious interest to outright skepticism. Newcomen engines had worked reliably for 50 years. Why risk operational disruption adopting new designs? Through 1770 and 1771, Boulton and Watt made minimal sales. They installed 3 engines, all at locations where they could closely supervise operations and resolve problems quickly. The installations succeeded technically, but generated little income. Annual premiums based on coal savings took time to accumulate. Meanwhile, Boulton was spending thousands annually on development, manufacturing, and marketing. His investment in Watt's engines had reached £8,000 by 1772, equaling his manufactory's entire annual profit from conventional products. He was betting everything on steam engines, and returns remained distant. Friends warned him about overextension. Some suggested Watt was brilliant, but impractical, that the engines would never justify their development costs. Boulton ignored them and increased his investment. He expanded Soho's capacity for engine manufacturing, hiring additional specialized machinists, purchasing better equipment, building dedicated workshops for cylinder production. He was preparing for success before success arrived, confident that superior technology would eventually overcome market resistance. It was either visionary leadership or dangerous overconfidence. Time would determine which. The breakthrough in patent protection came from unexpected direction. In 1775, Parliament passed an act extending Watt's patent for an additional 25 years beyond the original 14-year term. This unprecedented action resulted from Boulton's lobbying and convincing arguments that Watt had sacrificed years perfecting his invention before earning any returns. The extension meant patent protection until 1799, giving them 3 decades of exclusive rights instead of less than 2. The patent extension transformed commercial prospects entirely. Boulton could justify massive investment knowing he had decades to recover costs and generate profits. They could sell engines confidently, knowing competitors couldn't simply wait out the patent period before copying designs. The extension effectively validated Parliament's recognition that revolutionary innovations deserved exceptional protection. But with extended patents came increased scrutiny from competitors. Other engine manufacturers challenged Watt's patents legally, claiming his innovations were obvious variations on existing technology rather than genuine inventions. Through 1775 and 1776, Boulton and Watt fought 23 separate patent infringement cases, spending thousands of pounds on legal fees defending their intellectual property. The legal battles were exhausting and expensive, but they established important precedents. Courts consistently ruled that separate condensation was innovative enough to merit patent protection, that competitors couldn't use similar designs without licensing agreements. Each legal victory strengthened Boulton and Watt's market position while deterring future infringement attempts. Industrial espionage became another problem. Competitors sent workers to Soho posing as customers or potential employees, trying to learn manufacturing secrets. Some attempted bribing machinists for cylinder boring specifications. Others sketched engine components during installation visits, hoping to reverse engineer designs. Boulton implemented strict security procedures, limiting access to workshops, requiring non-disclosure agreements from employees, prosecuting espionage attempts aggressively. By 1777, Boulton had invested £17,000 in Watt's engines over 8 years without seeing substantial returns. £17,000 represented more than twice his manufacturer's annual profit from all other products. He was spectacularly overextended, betting his fortune and business on technology that remained commercially unproven despite clear technical superiority. Friends asked why he persisted. The question was reasonable. Boulton had built successful businesses without revolutionary innovations. He could continue profitably manufacturing buttons and buckles indefinitely. Why risk everything on steam engines that consumed capital without generating returns? His answer, when pressed, revealed vision that transcended mere profit calculation. He believed the industrial age was beginning, that steam power would transform manufacturing fundamentally, that whoever controlled superior engine technology would dominate the coming century. He believed James Watt had invented that superior technology, and that patient capital applied consistently would eventually produce returns dwarfing any conventional investment. He believed, in other words, that certain opportunities justified enormous risk, because success would be proportionally enormous. It was not entirely rational belief, not entirely calculated speculation. Boulton had faith in technology's transformative power, faith in Watt's genius, and faith in his own judgment about market timing. Whether that faith was justified or delusional would be determined in Cornwall's deep mines, where Watt engines were about to face their ultimate test in conditions that would reveal whether revolutionary technology could survive reality's brutal examination. Cornwall's mines descended deeper than anywhere else in Britain. Copper and tin lay in rich veins far below sea level, valuable beyond measure and absolutely inaccessible without constant pumping. Water seeped through rock fissures, accumulated in tunnels, and threatened to drown every profitable operation. The deeper the mines went, the more water they encountered, and the more coal they burned, keeping it at bay. Wheelbusy, near Chasey Water, reached 1,200 feet below the surface in 1777. At that depth, temperatures climbed toward 90 degrees Fahrenheit despite being far underground. The air was thick, humid, oppressive. Men worked in conditions that would kill them within hours without ventilation and constant water removal. The mine employed a Newcomen engine that consumed vast quantities of coal that had to be transported overland from distant sources at enormous expense. Cornwall's geography made coal expensive. The county had none of its own. Every ton arrived by ship or wagon, adding transport costs to already substantial fuel prices. A mine operating deep below sea level might spend half its revenue on coal for pumping. The economics were brutal but unavoidable. Without pumping, mines flooded and closed. With pumping, they barely remained profitable. This was where Watt's engines needed to prove themselves. Not in controlled workshop conditions, but in the harshest industrial environment imaginable, where failure meant flooding, where efficiency gains translated directly to mine survival, where skeptical Cornish engineers would accept nothing less than overwhelming superiority over proven technology. Boulton and Watt's first Cornish installation at Wheelbusy began in March of 1777. They brought a complete engine from Birmingham, along with skilled installers and Watt himself to supervise commissioning. The mine owners watched skeptically. They had invested heavily in their existing Newcomen engine. Switching to unproven technology risked catastrophic consequences if the new engine failed during critical pumping operations. Watt spent 2 weeks installing and calibrating the engine. The cylinder measured 18 inches in diameter, with a 5-foot stroke, capable of lifting water through pipes 20 inches across from extraordinary depths. The separate condenser sat below ground level, cooled by continuously flowing water. Every component had been manufactured at Soho to unprecedented precision, then transported carefully to Cornwall and assembled with meticulous attention to tolerances. The first test run happened on April 2nd, 1777. Watt fired the boiler, built steam pressure gradually, and opened valves that admitted steam to the cylinder. The piston rose smoothly, steam exhausted to the separate condenser, vacuum formed, and atmospheric pressure drove the piston downward with tremendous force. The great beam rocked, pumps engaged, and water began rising from 1,200 feet below, 18,000 gallons per hour. That was the measured pumping rate after 4 hours of continuous operation. 18,000 gallons hourly from depths where pressure would burst inferior seals, where heat stressed every mechanical component, where the slightest inefficiency would be magnified into catastrophic failure. The engine ran smoothly, consuming coal at rates that shocked the Cornish engineers monitoring fuel consumption. They measured carefully, recording every pound of coal burned and every gallon pumped. After 1 week of operation, the calculations were undeniable. Watt's engine consumed approximately 25%, the coal of a comparable Newcomen engine doing identical work. The savings at Wheel Busy amounted to £600 monthly, enough to pay for the engine's installation within 14 months, while continuing to save substantial sums thereafter. £600 monthly in a single mine. Multiply that by Cornwall's dozens of deep mines, then by hundreds of mines across Britain, and the economic impact became staggering. Watt and Boulton's pricing model, charging 1/3 of coal savings, meant they would earn roughly £200 monthly from Wheel Busy alone. Install 50 engines at similar mines, and annual revenue would exceed £100,000. The Cornish mining community responded immediately. Within 6 weeks of Wheel Busy's successful operation, Boulton and Watt received inquiries from 47 mine owners requesting installations. The orders represented years of manufacturing work and substantial capital requirements for building engines before receiving payment. Boulton committed to filling every order, expanding Soho's production capacity dramatically to meet demand. Through the summer and autumn of 1777, Watt engines arrived in Cornwall monthly. Each installation required weeks of careful assembly and testing. Each engine had to perform reliably in punishing conditions where failure meant flooded mines and lost fortunes. The pressure on Watt was immense. He travelled between installations, troubleshooting problems, training local engineers in maintenance procedures, ensuring every engine delivered the efficiency improvements that justified their cost. The engines worked. Some required adjustments, some revealed design flaws that needed correction in future units, but all of them substantially outperformed Newcomen engines. The separate condenser proved robust under extreme conditions. The precision manufacturing at Soho delivered components that maintained tight tolerances even after months of continuous operation. The technology Watt had envisioned in poverty, that Boulton had funded through years of losses, was finally succeeding spectacularly. By December of 1777, 18 Watt engines operated in Cornwall alone. Combined coal savings exceeded £10,000 monthly compared to the Newcomen engines they replaced. Mine owners, who had been sceptical now, competed for installation slots. Some offered premium payments for faster delivery. Others requested custom configurations for unusual mining conditions. The market Boulton had anticipated for a decade was materializing rapidly. The success attracted attention beyond mining. Manufacturers began inquiring whether Watt engines could power mills and factories. The engines generated smooth rotary motion, ideal for driving machinery, and they operated regardless of water availability, unlike water wheels that stop during droughts. If steam power could pump mines, it could surely power textile production, iron smelting, grain milling, and countless other applications currently dependent on water or animal power. Watt's response was cautious. The engines had been optimized for pumping, with reciprocating motion well suited to that application. Adapting them for rotary power would require significant redesign. The separate condenser worked brilliantly for pumping duty cycles, but might need modification for continuous rotary operation. He wasn't certain the technology could transfer successfully to factory applications without extensive development. Boulton was less cautious. He saw unlimited market potential if they could adapt engines for rotary power. Britain had perhaps 2,000 water-powered mills that would pay substantial sums for reliable steam power. Europe had thousands more. The global market for industrial power dwarfed mining applications. If they could perfect rotary steam engines, the Cornish mining success would seem modest by comparison. They began development work immediately, even while filling mining orders. Watt designed mechanisms for converting reciprocating piston motion into smooth rotary output. The technical challenges were substantial. Rotary engines needed different valve, timing, different condenser configurations, different approaches to load management. Everything that worked perfectly for pumping required reconsidering for rotation. The work would consume years and test whether Watt's genius extended beyond pumping applications. But standing in a Cornish mine engine house in late 1777, watching 18,000 gallons hourly rising from depths that would have been impossible without steam power, feeling the smooth rhythm of machinery operating exactly as mathematics predicted, it was difficult not to feel that anything was possible. The instrument maker, who had once earned 7 shillings daily while creditors demanded payment, had created technology transforming Britain's industrial foundations. The gamble had succeeded. Now the question was how much farther success could extend. The problem was elegant and maddeningly difficult. A steam engine piston moved up and down in straight lines. A factory's machinery rotated continuously. Converting one motion into the other without losing efficiency or reliability had defeated engineers for decades. Simple crank mechanisms worked, but created mechanical stresses that broke connections or wore out bearings within weeks of continuous operation. Watt began systematic experiments in 1780, building prototype mechanisms in Soho's workshops and testing them under loads that simulated factory conditions. Some designs worked briefly before failing catastrophically. Others introduced vibrations that would shake factory equipment apart. A few showed promise, but couldn't sustain the torque necessary for heavy manufacturing. He tried dozens of approaches through 1780 and 1781, gear systems that translated reciprocating motion into rotation, complex linkages that absorbed stress while transmitting power, flywheel arrangements that smoothed out the piston's irregular force into steady rotary output. Each design taught him something about the physics involved, and each ultimately proved inadequate for commercial deployment. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Watt invented the double-acting engine, where steam pushed the piston both upward and downward, instead of relying on atmospheric pressure for the return stroke. This doubled the power output per cycle and, more importantly, provided force in both directions that could be balanced mechanically. With pressure applied continuously rather than intermittently, converting to rotary motion became feasible. But double-acting operation required new valve systems, new piston sealing methods, new cylinder designs that could handle steam pressure from both sides. It meant redesigning everything he had perfected for pumping engines. The work consumed months of careful calculation and experimentation. Each component needed testing under steam pressure, then redesigning when flaws appeared, then testing again until performance met requirements. By 1782, Watt had working prototypes achieving 70 rotations per minute with remarkable smoothness. The motion was steady enough to power spinning machinery without damaging delicate threads. The torque was sufficient for heavy equipment. The efficiency remained excellent, with coal consumption per unit of work only slightly higher than pumping engines achieved. The parallel motion linkage he invented in 1784 solved the final major challenge. Converting vertical piston movement to rotary motion required guiding the piston rod in perfectly straight lines, while the rotating mechanism pulled it in curved paths. His linkage used geometrically arranged bars that constrained motion to within 1/16 of an inch of true vertical, preventing side forces that would damage cylinders or wear out seals prematurely. Watt was immensely proud of the parallel motion mechanism. Years later, he would describe it as his finest invention, more elegant than the separate condenser, because it solved a purely mechanical problem through geometric insight rather than thermodynamic analysis. The mechanism was beautiful in its mathematical precision, converting curved motion into straight-line movement without sliding contacts or friction losses. With double-acting engines and parallel motion linkages perfected, Boulton and Watt could offer factories a complete rotary power system. Cotton mills were the obvious first market. Britain's textile industry was expanding rapidly, but remained dependent on water wheels that stopped during summer droughts or winter freezes. Steam power promised year-round operation, regardless of weather, a transformative advantage for manufacturers competing in global markets. The first factory installation happened in 1785 at a Manchester cotton mill. The engine drove 20 looms simultaneously, achieving production rates that astonished mill owners accustomed to water power's limitations. The steam engine ran 24 hours daily when needed, limited only by worker endurance rather than natural forces. Productivity increased 12-fold compared to previous water-powered operations. Orders arrived rapidly. Mill owners understood immediately that steam power eliminated geography as a constraint. Water-powered mills had to locate near suitable rivers with reliable flow. Steam-powered mills could locate anywhere near raw material sources, near labor pools, near transportation networks, near markets. The strategic flexibility alone justified steam power's costs, before considering productivity advantages. Through 1785 and 1786, Boulton and Watt installed rotary engines at dozens of textile mills across northern England. Each installation demonstrated steam power's superiority convincingly. Mills that adopted early gained competitive advantages that threatened to bankrupt neighbours still dependent on water. The pressure to convert became irresistible for any manufacturer hoping to survive. Britain had approximately 2,000 water-powered mills when steam engines became commercially available. Within 5 years, hundreds had converted or were planning conversions. The transformation was extraordinarily rapid by industrial standards. Technologies that provided overwhelming advantages didn't wait for gradual adoption. They swept through industries, forcing adaptation or causing extinction. The rotary engines also opened markets beyond textiles. Flour mills adopted steam power, achieving consistent grinding regardless of seasonal water flow. Ironworks installed steam-powered hammers and rolling equipment, increasing production dramatically. Breweries, paper mills, sawmills, and countless other manufacturers discovered that steam power eliminated constraints that had limited their operations for centuries. By 1790, 300-watt engines operated across Britain. Roughly 2/3 powered factories, 1/3 pumped mines. Combined, they replaced the work of approximately 150,000 horses. That was the direct mechanical calculation. 300 engines, each doing work equivalent to 500 horses, meant eliminating the need for vast numbers of animals, along with the land required to feed them and the workers needed to care for them. But the calculation understated steam power's true impact. Horses couldn't work underground in mines. Horses couldn't drive heavy machinery at consistent speeds for 24 hours. Horses needed rest, food, veterinary care, and replacement when they aged or died. Steam engines operated continuously, consumed only coal and water, and remained productive for decades with proper maintenance. They didn't just replace horses, they enabled work horses couldn't perform. The efficiency of Watt's engines continued improving through incremental refinements. Better valve timing increased power output. Improved condenser designs reduced steam consumption. Enhanced cylinder boring techniques minimized leaks. By 1790, the best engines achieved fuel efficiency 5 times better than Newcomen engines, approaching the theoretical limits Watt had calculated decades earlier in poverty. The success was overwhelming by any measure except one that mattered personally to Watt. The work consumed him entirely. He travelled constantly between installations, troubleshooting problems, training operators, refining designs. The pace was exhausting and never-ending. Success meant more orders, which meant more installations, which meant more travel and more problems demanding his attention. He remarried in 1776, wedding Anne MacGregor, who gave him 2 children and managed household affairs that Watt largely ignored. He was absent frequently, distracted constantly, obsessed with engine performance even during rare moments at home. The personal cost of revolutionary innovation was measured not just in years of poverty, but in decades of relentless work that left little energy for anything beyond machines. But standing in a Manchester mill in 1790, watching looms powered by his engines, producing textiles around the clock, it was impossible not to recognize the magnitude of what had been achieved. The separate condenser, conceived in desperate poverty 27 years earlier, had become the heart of Britain's industrial transformation. The instrument maker who once earned 7 shillings daily now earned thousands annually from engine premiums. The man who had nearly been imprisoned for debt was fundamentally altering the relationship between human ambition and natural limits. Steam power, perfected through decades of effort, was revealing that those limits were far more flexible than anyone had imagined. The 1790s witnessed something unprecedented in human history: technology spreading across continents within a single decade. Watt's engines, perfected in Birmingham workshops, appeared in locations so distant that shipping components required months of dangerous ocean travel, yet demand was insatiable. Wherever mineral wealth lay deep underground, or factories sought reliable power, Watt engines represented the difference between prosperity and failure. Mexico's silver mines operated at depths exceeding anything in Cornwall. At Guanajuato, miners extracted silver from shafts reaching 2,000 feet below the surface, depths where water infiltration overwhelmed traditional pumping methods. Spanish colonial authorities had tried everything: larger Newcomen engines, teams of horses turning water wheels, even human-powered bucket chains employing hundreds of workers. Nothing achieved adequate pumping at sustainable costs. Boulton and Watt received their first Mexican inquiry in 1791. The correspondence travelled 6 months each direction. Technical specifications, cost estimates, installation timelines, everything moved at the pace of sailing ships crossing the Atlantic. Yet the Mexican mine owners persisted. Their operations generated enormous wealth when functioning, but faced constant flooding that shut down production for months yearly. Watt engines promised to solve problems no other technology could address. The first Mexican installation required 18 months from order to operation. Components manufactured at Soho travelled by wagon to Liverpool, by ship to Veracruz, then overland by mule train to Guanajuato. Skilled installers made the same journey, bringing specialized tools and detailed installation manuals. The engine that pumped 18,000 gallons hourly at Wheel Busy would pump similar quantities from even greater depths in Mexico, transforming silver mining economics across New Spain. Holland presented different challenges. The Dutch had been pumping water for centuries, keeping polders dry and creating farmland from former seabed. But their windmill-powered pumps were unreliable, dependent on weather patterns that could leave critical drainage systems idle for days during calm periods. Steam power meant continuous operation regardless of wind, eliminating the risk of catastrophic flooding during extended calms. Dutch engineers initially resisted British technology on nationalist grounds. Holland had its own engineering traditions, its own pump designs refined over generations. Why import expensive machinery from Birmingham when local solutions existed? The answer arrived with the first Watt engine installation near Amsterdam in 1793. The engine pumped continuously for 6 months without stopping, during which time traditional windmills sat idle for 3 weeks due to calm weather. The comparison was stark enough to overcome national pride. America represented Boulton and Watt's most significant foreign market potential. The young nation was industrializing rapidly, but lacked Britain's engineering expertise and manufacturing infrastructure. American entrepreneurs eagerly sought technologies that would allow them to compete with established European manufacturers. Steam power was exactly such technology: revolutionary, accessible to those who could afford it, and not dependent on geography or climate. The first American Watt engine powered a steamboat on the Delaware River in 1796. This represented significant adaptation from the technology's original pumping purpose. Marine applications required engines optimized for consistent rotary power, compact enough for shipboard installation, reliable despite constant vibration and motion. Watt's rotary engines met these requirements with minor modifications, opening entirely new markets. John Fitch, the American engineer who installed that first steamboat engine, corresponded extensively with Watt about marine applications. Ships powered by steam could travel upstream, operate in calm weather, maintain schedules regardless of wind direction. River, transportation, coastwise shipping, even ocean crossings became feasible with adequate engine power and fuel capacity. Steam was liberating transportation from nature's constraints just as it had liberated manufacturing. But the most dramatic impact of Watt engines spreading globally was their effect on resource extraction industries. Iron production increased spectacularly during the 1790s, driven by steam-powered mining, smelting, and manufacturing. British iron production climbed from 17,000 tons annually in 1780 to 250,000 tons by 1800. That 15-fold increase in 2 decades reflected steam power, enabling deeper mining, more efficient smelting, and mechanized processing that would have been impossible with traditional power sources. Coal mining expanded even more dramatically. Britain produced approximately 6 million tons of coal annually when Watt began his experiments. By 1800, production exceeded 16 million tons, nearly triple earlier output. The increase wasn't coincidental. Steam engines enabled deeper mining, and deeper mines contained vast coal reserves previously inaccessible. The engines consumed coal, but enabled extracting far more coal than they burned, creating a positive feedback loop that accelerated industrial expansion. Consider what this meant practically. Every steam engine burning coal to pump mines allowed extracting coal from depths that would otherwise flood. That extracted coal powered more engines, which enabled deeper mining still, which provided coal for even more engines. The system was self-reinforcing, limited only by manufacturing capacity and investment capital rather than fundamental resource constraints. Steam power had discovered how to multiply energy rather than simply converting it. Watt's son, James Jr., became essential to global expansion. Born in 1769, he grew up surrounded by engine development work and absorbed technical knowledge naturally. By his early 20s, he was traveling internationally, overseeing installations from Russia to India, solving problems his father was too old and too famous to address personally. James Jr. had his father's technical brilliance, but better interpersonal skills and more patience with customers' concerns. The Russian installations tested James Jr.'s capabilities severely. Siberian mining operations faced challenges unknown in Britain: extreme cold that froze water lines, vast distances from manufacturing centres, languages and customs that complicated technical communication. He spent 2 years in Russia during the mid-1790s, installing engines, training local operators, establishing maintenance procedures that would function without constant British supervision. India presented similar challenges with additional complexity from climate. Engines designed for British weather required modification for tropical heat and monsoon humidity. Cylinder cooling systems that worked perfectly in Cornwall failed in Calcutta's heat. James Jr. redesigned condensers with greater cooling capacity, specified different lubricants for high temperatures, adapted dozens of components for conditions his father had never anticipated. Each international installation generated knowledge that improved subsequent designs. Problems encountered in Mexico informed solutions for Dutch installations. Russian modifications proved useful in India. The technology was evolving through global deployment, becoming more robust and adaptable through exposure to extreme conditions worldwide. By 1799, Boulton and Watt's business had grown beyond anything they had imagined 20 years earlier. Their engines operated on 4 continents. Annual revenue exceeded £50,000, with substantial growth projected. Soho Manufactory employed over 1,000 workers in engine production alone. They had survived patent battles, overcome technical challenges, and built a global business based on technology invented in desperate poverty. Watt himself, now 63 years old, was withdrawing gradually from daily operations. He consulted on difficult technical problems but left routine matters to James Jr. and to Bolton's sons, who were joining the business. His health was declining, the decades of relentless work extracting their toll, but he could afford excellent medical care now, could live comfortably in retirement, could look back on achievements that had transformed civilization. His annual income exceeded £12,000 more than most aristocrats, earned entirely from engine premiums charging 1/3 of coal savings. The man who had once owed 7 shillings daily in debt, while earning 7 shillings daily in income, now earned more in a month than he had in his first decade at Glasgow University. The reversal was complete, spectacular, and entirely merited by contributions to human progress that were impossible to overstate. Yet, Watt remained characteristically modest about his success. He had solved one important problem: inefficient steam engines. That solution enabled others to do remarkable things: mine deeper, manufacture more, travel farther, build bigger. But those achievements belonged to the people using his engines, not to him. He had provided a tool. They had built empires with it. James Watt died on August 25, 1819, at age 83, in his home at Heathfield near Birmingham. He had lived long enough to see steam engines powering factories across Europe, pumping mines on 3 continents, driving ships along rivers and coastlines. He had witnessed the beginning of transformation he had enabled, but would never see completed. The Industrial Revolution he helped trigger was perhaps 1/10 finished when he died, its full implications still decades from realization. His name had already become the international unit of power before his death. Scientists measuring engine output, calculating energy consumption, or comparing different power sources used the watt as their standard unit. 1 horsepower equaled 746 watts, a precise mathematical relationship defining how mechanical work translated into practical capability. The instrument maker who had once struggled to earn 7 shillings daily now had his name permanently embedded in physics, used millions of times daily by engineers worldwide. Consider the elegance of that tribute. Watt hadn't merely invented better engines, he had established the fundamental relationship between energy input and useful work output. His experiments measuring coal consumption and calculating efficiency gains created the mathematical framework that would govern all future power systems. Every power plant built in the 2 centuries after his death used principles he discovered while nearly bankrupt in Glasgow. The relationship between heat, pressure, and mechanical work that defines thermodynamics. The efficiency improvements he pioneered had immediate practical effects that grew more significant over time. A Newcomen engine, consuming 24 pounds of coal per horsepower hour, represented enormous waste. Britain's mines collectively burned millions of pounds of coal annually, just maintaining pumping operations. When Watt's engines reduced consumption to 5 pounds per horsepower hour, the coal savings exceeded Britain's entire annual coal production from earlier decades. Think about what that meant. The coal saved by efficiency improvements provided fuel for additional engines, which enabled deeper mining, which produced more coal, which powered more engines. The positive feedback loop Watt's technology created didn't just improve existing operations, it enabled entirely new industrial activities that would have been impossible, with inefficient engines consuming all available fuel just maintaining basic operations. By 1819, steam power had become so ubiquitous that younger generations couldn't imagine industry without it. Factories operated continuously, regardless of weather. Mines extracted minerals from depths that would have been impossible 30 years earlier. Ships travelled upstream against currents that would have stopped sailing vessels. The transformation was so complete that Watt's revolutionary contribution risked being forgotten because it had succeeded so thoroughly. But the numbers preserved the story. When Watt began his experiments in 1763, Britain produced perhaps 6 million tons of coal annually. By 1819, production exceeded 20 million tons. Iron production had increased from 17,000 tons to over 400,000 tons annually. Textile manufacturing had grown tenfold. Transportation networks had expanded dramatically. Population in industrial cities had doubled or tripled as people moved from agricultural work to factory employment. Not all of that growth came from steam engines alone, but steam power enabled the scale and speed of transformation. Without reliable industrial power, factories would have remained small water-powered operations. Without efficient pumping, mines would have remained shallow. Without mechanical advantage measured in hundreds of horsepower, heavy industries like iron smelting and shipbuilding would have remained limited by human and animal labor constraints. Watt's personal fortune at his death exceeded £500,000. The man who had come within 3 days of debtor's prison in 1765 left an estate that would sustain his descendants for generations. The reversal was extraordinary but entirely justified by the value he had created. His engines saved British industry more money in coal costs during his lifetime than his entire fortune represented. Society benefited far more than he personally gained. Matthew Boulton had died 9 years earlier, in 1810, leaving his own substantial fortune and a manufacturing empire that would continue for decades. The partnership between them had been genuinely collaborative, Boulton providing capital, business acumen, and manufacturing capability, while Watt provided technical genius and relentless perfectionism. Neither could have succeeded without the other. Revolutionary technology required both invention and implementation, vision and execution, ideas and capital. The patents that protected their work expired in 1800, allowing competitors to build similar engines without licensing fees. But by then, Boulton and Watt had established such manufacturing expertise and reputation that competition barely affected their business. Customers preferred engines from the original inventors, knowing that quality and reliability mattered more than marginal cost savings. Excellence, once established, created advantages that outlasted legal protections. What Watt demonstrated through his life was that pressure, whether steam pressure or life circumstances, could drive transformation. His poverty had been crushing, his wife's illness devastating, his debts nearly destroying. Yet that pressure forced him to focus intensely on problems that might otherwise have remained merely interesting puzzles. Desperation drove innovation in ways that comfort never could have achieved. But pressure alone wasn't sufficient. Watt also needed Matthew Boulton's patient capital, willing to invest £17,000 over 8 years before seeing returns. He needed Britain's growing industrial economy, creating demand for better power sources. He needed Parliament's willingness to extend patents, protecting revolutionary innovations. Success required both individual brilliance and social systems that supported long-term technological development. Today, more than 2 centuries after Watt's death, every power plant on Earth uses descendants of principles he discovered. Whether burning coal, natural gas, or nuclear fuel to create steam, whether using internal combustion or jet turbines, all power systems operate on thermodynamic relationships Watt helped establish. The efficiency equations he developed remain fundamental to engineering. His name appears in physics textbooks, on electric meters, in technical specifications for equipment ranging from light bulbs to locomotives. The industrial world he helped create now faces challenges he couldn't have imagined. Climate change driven by burning fossil fuels, resource depletion from ever deeper mining, environmental damage from industrial waste. These are consequences of success at scales Watt never anticipated. His engines liberated humanity from energy constraints that had limited civilization for millennia. We're now discovering that liberation creates its own constraints, different but equally profound. Yet the mathematical relationship between energy and progress that Watt established remains valid. Efficient use of resources still matters enormously. The difference between wasting 99% of energy and converting 80% into useful work still determines whether technologies succeed or fail. Watt's fundamental insight that understanding and minimizing losses enables achieving more with less remains as relevant to solar panels and wind turbines as it was to steam engines. Consider where humanity stood when Watt began his experiments and where we stand now. In 1763, mechanical power came from muscles, falling water, or wind. Civilization's energy budget was essentially fixed by available animals and geography. 250 years later, humanity commands energy equivalent to billions of horses working continuously. That transformation, from energy scarcity to energy abundance, began in a cramped Glasgow workshop where a desperate instrument maker couldn't pay his debts but could see how to make machines work better. The story of James Watt isn't just about one man's triumph over adversity, though that alone would be remarkable. It's about how revolutionary ideas emerge from pressure, how patient capital enables transformation, how technical excellence creates lasting value, and how individual human ingenuity can alter civilization's trajectory. The instrument maker, who earned 7 shillings daily, changed the world more profoundly than most monarchs or generals ever managed. His weapon was understanding, his battlefield was a workshop, his victory was measuring power itself and discovering how to multiply it beyond anyone's imagination. That legacy endures in every electric light illuminated, every vehicle moving, every factory operating. The what, the unit, the man, the achievement remains fundamental to human progress. And perhaps that's the ultimate measure of a life well lived, not wealth accumulated or honors received, but contributions so profound they become invisible through ubiquity, woven so completely into civilization's fabric that we can hardly imagine existence without them.